I suppose on the one hand, the rest of UK's soft power will still very much be there, but you have to immediately pause and think, what are you even going to call this entity? It may be the continuator state, so it will still presumably have the UK's legal rights, but will it still be called the UK? It won't look very united. If Northern Ireland is still there and Scotland isn't, it will be a bit awkward to call it Britain. So I think it will be a huge shock to the rest of the UK. And I think there's been so much discussion focused on Scottish independence and what that means for Scotland and what the economic costs and benefits may be for Scotland and whether and how fast it will get into the European Union and things like that that I've written about. And we've only just, in the last year, I would say, really started to see some serious thinking and commentary from England about what England would look like. And it's interesting that quite fast people stop trying to say rest of UK or England and Wales if Northern Ireland eventually reunified with Ireland. And a lot of the time, the big question and the big elephant in the room is England, and what will that England be? And whether with or without Wales and Northern Ireland, it's going to be a big country with a big population. Scotland is only 8% of the UK's population. But I think it's going to be an internal shock to England. So in terms of projecting its own soft power, it's going to have to rethink its own identity and what that means. And when I was talking to some different commentators and diplomats and other people off the record last autumn for a research project I was doing, and when I asked them about the scenario in about maybe 10 years' time that Scotland might be independent, and then asked them about the UK, I got comments like, well, that would be extraordinary. That would be a national humiliation. Or somebody in Brussels said to me, well, that will be schadenfreude and payback for Brexit. So I think it's not just about what that England or rest of the UK does, it's the rest of the world has already looked on, especially the rest of Europe has already looked on with a certain degree of horror and bafflement at the self-harm of Brexit. And then to see this kind of old state break up will again add to that sense that UK politics is maybe, it's failing in some sense, or at least it's not working properly. So I think it's a question of these two different things. On the one hand, this will still be a wealthy and relatively powerful state, same size as Italy, for instance. So it will still, in a way, have that soft power, but it will be being looked at very differently from the outside, as well as perhaps being in some turmoil inside. It's already very divided about, is it going to carry on down this Brexit global Britain route, or is the European half of the English population going to vote and swing it another way? So I think that those are two quite big dynamics to handle, how the rest of the world is looking at you and how you're seeing your own identity.
The loss of part of its territory, albeit through a democratic process, would be seen as a very major event. And you could see those who don't wish much goodwill towards the UK believing that has weakened the UK's power and its projection of the power. You can see even the UK's friends wondering about what has become of a country that used to be a byword for stability, common sense, not desperately exciting maybe, but a very reliable partner in the international scene. And you might say that the practical implications of Scotland leaving on soft power maybe not that great. It's a tenth of the population, it's rather more of the landmass. But in terms of UK prosperity, UK wealth, UK culture, projection of all of that, some people might think, well, this hasn't made a huge difference. But I think it would be the psychological impact of that, which would be noted around the world. And most people would conclude, I think, understandably and naturally that this has been a diminution of the capacity of what would be Remainder UK to project its interests.
I don't know how popular or acceptable a transition would be seen if there was an argument to keep the nuclear deterrent in an independent Scotland for 10 years. But I think one of the things that maybe needs much more thought in general about independence is that the whole thing is a question of multiple transitions. You're transitioning from the UK, you think you want to transition into the European Union, into NATO. You've got all sorts of state institutions to set up, huge amount of learning ahead of you. So would it be politically too sensitive to say 10 years, for instance, or would 5 years be it, and how useful is that? I'm not an expert on how long it takes you to do a suitable relocation. But what I'm not expecting is that an independent Scotland would suddenly change its mind and say, yep, that's fine, you can keep locating them in Scotland. It's quite a tricky challenge, because if you think that the rest of the UK, just say population size is going to be 60 million versus 5 million, but 1/3 of Britain's landmass is Scotland, and as you say, that very exposed North Sea, Atlantic coasts. And so I think an independent Scotland, especially in the early years, and perhaps carrying on after that, would be looking to the UK for a lot of support there as part of NATO. Now, Republic of Ireland manages, its exposed position in that. So I'm certainly not saying it's impossible, but I think that discussion, as well as the nuclear discussion, as well as other discussions, just shows you it's going to be really important that this is quite a good and friendly relationship. And yet it may be, just as we saw with Brexit, that is actually going for a while to be a very bad-tempered relationship. And if you talk to the pro-independence people, or the SNP, or Nicola Sturgeon will say this, they say, oh, England will be our closest friends. And that's easy to say, but actually, where is the work to take it down a level, not just in soft and hard security, but actually across the board? What are the things you're going to still do together? How are you going to do them together? How are you going to do them together if Scotland's in the European Union, but the rest of the UK or England and Wales isn't? So I think there would need to be a lot of cooperation, and just the fact of sharing an island, you're going to need to cooperate. And of course, the waters issue will come up not only in security, but in issues like fishing, which was so sensitive in the EU-UK trade agreement. And depending where EU-UK relations go in the next few years, if they get better or stay rather fractious, I think that trade agreement, when Scotland became independent, would partly have to be reworked, because, for instance, a lot of the fishing waters would now be owned by Scotland. The size of the UK's economy would have changed. So even if there's more, for instance, and better soft security cooperation on things like databases and police cooperation, quite a bit of that is then going to have to be unpicked and re-put back together. And none of that has to be highly problematic, but it's all just quite a lot of work.
It will be enormously important to both an independent Scotland and Remainder UK that they seek very rapidly to establish a security partnership, both militarily and in terms of counter-terrorism and the rest of it. Scotland will be the second land border for the Remainder UK. It will be Remainder UK's most important neighbour, and the integrity of the defence of these islands will depend on close working between what will be two independent countries. So a lot will depend on the way that the independence negotiations are conducted, the attitude of both governments. But the optimal outcome from any reasonable perspective of the interests of both countries would be a continued close collaboration. Obviously, Remainder UK needs that reach of the Scottish landmass into the North Sea and into the Northwest Atlantic. But clearly, one of the major issues would be the future of the nuclear subbase at Fowles Lane, and how an incoming government in independent Scotland would view that, and what sort of negotiation there would be around that. It would be enormously expensive for the remainder UK to have to replace Fowles Lane as a base. But of course, the successive governments in Scotland, SNP governments, and the SNP itself have been consistently against the siting of nuclear deterrent in an independent Scotland. So that would be a real bone of contention and a really tough problem to resolve. But from an independent Scotland's perspective, of course, it would be seeking to establish its reputation internationally, possibly seeking to join NATO, building good relations, not least with the US. So for an independent Scotland, the siting of that deterrent would not just be a question about its relations with the remainder UK, it would be, in my view, also about its position in the international order, because the allies of remainder UK and the putative allies of an independent Scotland would be almost certainly very, very concerned if the first act of an independent Scotland was to serve an eviction order on the government of remainder UK in terms of where it parks its nuclear submarines. It would be a strong negotiating card for the government of an independent Scotland. But bear in mind the nature of that negotiating card, because this would not be, if you like, their ace, given the concerns that the allies of the UK would have if an independent Scotland were to undermine the capacity of remainder UK to operate its nuclear deterrent. And there would be huge pressure on the government of independent Scotland to position itself so that it could present itself to the international community, its putative allies, as a responsible member of the Western Alliance, particularly if it was seeking to join NATO. And against that would be the repeated promises made by the SNP and others to remove the nuclear deterrent from Scottish soil. So that's as a political issue, this would be one that would, I think, preoccupy both sides in the early years of independence. There are obviously solutions there, but they won't meet everybody's aspirations. The most obvious solution is a sort of long-term lease of the base to accept that geopolitical reality of the importance of that base in terms of Western security. But that clearly would upset a substantial proportion of opinion in Scotland. So how the government of an independent Scotland would walk that line would be one of its early tests. If the negotiation was conducted with goodwill on both sides, then it would be possible, one assumes, to ensure that all of the activities that currently ensure the security of Scotland within the UK and of the wider UK itself could continue over a period of negotiations. But I can't stress enough how much depends on the nature of the negotiation. And if it was an acrimonious negotiation, then of course the risk of a break in continuity in terms of the projection and military capability becomes that much greater. And this is, it seems to me, is absolutely critical to the thinking of the government of the remainder UK. As we know from Brexit, there will be a temptation to go into those negotiations in a spirit of anger, of upset that Scotland, the people of Scotland, have chosen to leave the UK, and therefore to seek to wield the greater power of remainder UK, in a sense to put the people of Scotland in their place. That would, in my view, be a huge strategic error. Scotland will be remained the UK's most important neighbour. The people of Scotland will continue to think of themselves as friends and literally relatives of so many folk in England. It will be, and Wales and indeed Northern Ireland, it will be in the interests of the UK to go into that negotiation in a spirit of conciliation and of friendship in order to establish the best possible relations with an independent Scotland. There is no conceivable scenario in which it would be the interests of remainder UK to have a grudging and difficult relationship with what would be its northern neighbour. Now, whether the government of remainder UK would be wise enough to see that and to go to an English and Welsh and Northern Irish public to say, we are going to have to make concessions in this negotiation, despite the fact that we're all upset that the Scots have chosen to leave, will again be one of the big political issues around the independence negotiations. A spirit of generosity, of seeking to ensure to help the new state get on its feet, to prosper economically, to prosper in international terms, would be an act of benefit for remainder UK as well as for Scotland.
I think the devil in some sense is in the detail here about the specific trade, and a lot of the Scottish English trade is services, and you mentioned renewable energy, and so the issues of energy transfers and electricity transfers and wind power and so on, I think is really important. And sometimes when it comes up here, I mean, there can often be a certain amount of hand waving about how an independent Scotland is going to manage. And so when I raise the issue of the border, people often say, well, it's going to be okay because the rest of the UK is still going to want to buy our goods and they're going to want our energy. But that's not taking into account EU energy policy and common EU policies on these. And again, there will be a lot of evidence from how Brexit has worked out in terms of things like energy flows and electricity flows and sharing to guide Scotland and England. But I think these things are not small. So the economic shock, as I say, is probably more to Scotland than to the rest of the UK. But they're very intertwined. And I think on the services side, it's interesting because, of course, the EU-UK trade deal didn't have very much there on services. And that could actually be, to some extent, a plus in the case of independence, because what the UK is faced with at the moment in Brexit is negotiating services access across the 27 individual member states where there isn't an EU common market in services. But to do that bilaterally, just rest of UK and Scotland, maybe wouldn't be such hard work. I think the real problem would be where it contradicts or comes into conflict with existing EU common policies. And also, you know, I think especially on the kind of police cooperation, the criminal cooperation, of course, that's carrying on between the EU and UK, but it's not carrying on to the same level it was at before. And so I don't think Scotland's going to get any opt-outs to allow it to have a closer cooperation. So again, the fact that this is a land border, I think, is quite interesting. We're going to have, you know, a lot of evidence from Brexit, from how the UK trades with France, with the Republic of Ireland, with the special Northern Ireland Protocol, and that will give an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK a lot of guidance. But this is a land border, which, whether you're talking about agricultural health or crime cooperation or Russian jets or submarines, you know, all these things rather interconnect if you're sharing an island. In some ways, you could perhaps say the former Czechoslovakia is a precedent. It was a rather extraordinary divorce in a way, velvet maybe, but rather top down. But equally, it didn't, in the end, it didn't impede both countries' progress towards the European Union. There was a moment in the late 1990s when there was a of the 10 Central and East European candidate countries, there was a front runner group and a second group, and I think the Czechs were in the first and the Slovaks in the second, but in the end, they all came together, and apart from Bulgaria and Romania, joined at the same time in 2004. And then obviously you saw states like the Baltic states who finally managed to leave the Soviet bloc and re-establish themselves. So there's plenty of examples in different ways of states and countries re-establishing themselves or splitting off from larger entities. But probably the best precedent, although it's now 100 years ago, is the Irish one, of course. And I am struck again and again. Obviously, Ireland has had a lot of praise for how it played the Brexit process, its diplomacy, the way it sort of explained its case to the rest of the EU, and it, as a result, got the support it wanted in the face of Brexit. But Irish diplomats, I hear them again and again say, oh, but the UK is family. The UK is family, you know, and you've got the common travel area, which presumably an independent Scotland would be in and have an opt-out from Schengen, just as Ireland has one and as the UK had one. And the Irish, I think, have very, again, quite a much, not just grown up, but a very thought through, because of the whole issues of the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement and so forth. I'm much more commonly in Dublin or on Zoom to Dublin and hearing discussions of multi-level identity and multi-level governance and how that works and doesn't work, of course, in the face of Brexit. And there is some of that here in Scotland, but I think there probably needs to be a lot more. But that's where the big lacuna, I think, with England being 85% of the population, is what is the English future multi-level identity going to be, and what sort of cross these aisles, you know, again, the Irish have thought a lot about East-West and North-South relations, and relations in the context of the EU, relations in the context of their wider foreign policy. So although, you know, Scotland looks to Ireland a lot, just as it looks eastward as well to some of the Nordic countries of similar sizes and so on, but I think the rest of the UK, especially England and Wales, could think a lot more about that too. And I think there's a fear that, oh, if we start talking about this, maybe we'll encourage, you know, the independence movement in Scotland and so on. And I think that's a pity. So you have Labour setting up a commission on federalism, and that could come to all sorts of interesting ideas, perhaps, about how the different constituent parts of the UK interact and what new structures you might have. It wouldn't necessarily, some of that might be very similar to some of the structures you might have if Scotland went independent or Northern Ireland reunified. And so I think the fact that this is a live campaign and a live conflict over independence makes that discussion of how that could work very difficult. And I think it could, again, as I say, Irish diplomacy and the way it worked, the way it has worked, especially recently, you know, is quite an object lesson. But there's got to be a willingness to look at those object lessons.
There really is no modern parallel to speak of. There might have been if Quebec had voted differently and in those two referendums, but it's not really comparable to any of the other state breakups, either former Soviet Union or the former Yugoslavia. So we would be in unprecedented territory, and the fact of these two countries still living on the same island will drive so much of the long-term sort of strategic positioning of the governments of both countries. And sensible politicians and sensible statecraft would recognise that so many of the interests of both countries remain closely knitted together, and one would hope that would see that in in ongoing collaboration in the decades beyond independence. But I come back to it, a lot will depend on the attitudes of the two governments as they go into those negotiations as to what the starting point is.
If it comes to independence, so if it comes to this scenario we're discussing, you're really going to need to create and keep what is good still about those relationships. And that's why I certainly hope, come Indie Ref 2, that the pro-UK side doesn't threaten that an independent Scotland couldn't be in that common travel area. Because of course, if you're in the common travel area, there's no passports, you can live and work in each other's country, you can visit as much as you want, and we're on the same island. And the idea that instead it would be a hard EU border for people as well, I think, you know, when you let that sink in on both sides, you know, nobody's going to like that, and not being able to go down and visit family and friends, or come up and visit family and friends. But I think, you know, how this process happens, if it happens, is the crucial thing, or at least how you mend it after it happens, how you handle the divorce. And I think one interesting thing about the divorce is, of course, the EU would probably say to you, if you ask someone in Brussels, they'd say to you, well, you know, third country, constitutional matter, we're not going to get involved. But I think in many ways they are going to have to get involved, because, for instance, as we talked about earlier, if on day one of independence, there's no EU deal of any sort with the new Scotland, it's got to be created. And yet Scotland now controls a big chunk of what were UK fishing waters. There's going to be a big hole and gap for everybody. So the EU will be very wary around that, and a huge chunk of it, they'll just say, you two go away and tell us what your divorce arrangements are. But perhaps if the EU just has to get involved to some extent because of Brexit, perhaps it might actually help, you know, and try and cool the tensions, rather than just have a kind of blame game. And so much of that relationship, assuming an independent Scotland is in the EU, will be determined by the EU afterward.
This I think would be probably the biggest impact of all on Remainder UK. It is the self-perception of the country, and that would, I think, set in train a process of reflection, the outcome of which is really quite difficult to predict, in terms of the politics of Remainder UK, whether Remainder UK continues to be Remainder UK or ends up just as three constituent parts, or unification in Ireland and Wales going its own way as well. What that means for the political makeup in England, what it means for the sense of Englishness and the projection of Englishness. All of those would become, I think, major issues for soul searching and reflection in Remainder UK. And nobody's really thought about that. So, and we know from all the polling that there's a lot of folk in England are frankly indifferent about Scotland going, but they need to take a hard look in the mirror and ask the question, you know, should this be a question of indifference for people in England, or should they be rather more concerned about it? Quite a lot still are, happily, but there's plenty who aren't. And I think they're underestimating the impact the loss of the union would have on their sense of well-being in the world, if I could put it like that. I think it would be, as I say, the psychological impact, I suspect, would be huge.